Well, thank you all for coming to this important, timely discussion on race and inequality 50 years after the publication of the Kerner Report. We've had a very lively, I might say more academic discussion for the last several hours that have brought out a lot of the dimensions of what has happened since in the 50 years since the Kerner Report, and I hope we'll continue to have a lively discussion. 50 years is a long time ago. One of the very moving things about the commemoration when the book came out on the 50th anniversary was Fred Harris was in the audience, was one of the members of the commission, and lively and forceful as ever. But I was only 25 years old when the Kerner Report declared famously that our nation is headed towards two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. Since then, some problematic areas identified in the report have gotten better. Participation in politics and government by African Americans, for example, symbolized by the election of an African American president. Other areas have stayed the same, like education and employment disparities. Some factors, on the other hand, such as wealth and income inequality, have arguably gotten worse. This afternoon, we hold a research panel gathering some of the most important voices on the topic of race to outline these problems. This evening, we spotlight individuals and institutions who are actively working toward solutions. Before we begin, I would like to take a moment to thank all those that made this event possible. First, I'd like to thank Alan Curtis and the Eisenhower Foundation for putting together this report, reflecting on what's happened in 50 years, and for inviting me to contribute a chapter to this book. And I urge you all to read it. And there is Alan and Fred Harris wrote a beautiful op-ed in the New York Times. If you missed it, you should go back and look at it, summarizing some of the main insights. I have to thank Andrew Kosenko, who's my RA and working on that particular chapter. I want to thank Rob Johnson, who couldn't be here today, who's the head of the Institute for New Economic Thinking. He fell down and broke some ribs, but they've provided important support. And I want to thank Dan Flaherty for help in putting together the program. And then a few more, thank my assistant, Caleb Odom, for all of his work in organizing this event. And finally, I want to thank all the speakers that came here today to share their inspiring work that will hopefully move us toward a more just and unified society. With that, I welcome Alan Curtis, President of the Eisenhower Foundation, to the podium.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Joe. The old LBJ stories that Fred Harris tells are beyond comprehension sometimes. I would be happy at dinner or at other events to share some of those stories, but they get pretty wild. I do want to thank the Institute for New Economic Thinking, the American Assembly, and the Roosevelt Institute for having this important forum today. We are updating the Kerner Commission report, but it's not unrelated that today is the anniversary of the Columbine gun massacre, a reality I will return to in a moment. The essence of the original Kerner Commission report in '68 was that America had a long way to go in reducing poverty, inequality, and racial injustice. 50 years later, we conclude in Healing Our Divided Society that America still has a long ways to go. But we have at least built up much more evidence on what works, I would argue, and also on what doesn't work. We now need to generate what the Kerner Commission called new will among the American people to scale up and legislate what we know to work for the poor, the working class, and the middle class of all races. Over the 50 years since the Kerner Commission, we have twice elected an African American president, and there's certainly debate on his record, which I heard today. There has been a dramatic increase in the number of African American and Latino elected officials. The African American and Latino middle classes have expanded, and everyone here has seen Black Panther. But Mr. Coates, as Mr. Baldwin, speaks truth to power. Neo-Nazis have become emboldened in Charlottesville, Virginia, and many other places. Black Lives Matter have revealed what Americans did not want to see in Ferguson and in many other places. Zero-tolerance policing against people of color has failed. Sentencing laws remain racially biased. About 200,000 people were incarcerated in 1968. Today, the prison industrial complex holds 1.4 million, and they are disproportionately people of color. In many ways, mass incarceration has become our housing policy for the poor. And that housing policy has included conscious, purposeful, government-created segregation, as Richard Rothstein brilliantly has documented in The Color of Law. Public school segregation has increased since the Kerner Commission. Overall child poverty has increased. Deep poverty has increased, in part because of what the late Molly Ivins called the welfare deform of the 1990s. Income and wealth inequality have increased and were accelerated by the supply-side created Great Recession of 2008. Through good times and bad times over the last 50 years, the ratio of African American to white unemployment, as we have seen, has continued to be about 2 to 1. In comparison to all other industrialized democracies, America has the highest rates of overall child poverty, homicide, and incarceration. But in the long run, none of this really has to be. There is an incipient movement today to base policy on evidence, not ideology. We need to add momentum to that movement, however long that movement takes. In terms of Kerner priorities, what are some examples of evidence policy that works? The Kerner Commission's recommendations began with economic and education priorities. Today, that means we need proven demand-side Keynesian economic policy that links job training to full employment job creation to job placement. We need a significantly higher minimum wage, more power for labor unions, trade policy that benefits workers, and single-payer health insurance for all Americans. Among other outcomes, such economic policy must strive to eliminate that historic 2 to 1 black to white unemployment ratio. What does evidence-based policy mean in education? We need housing and therefore school integration combined with much more equitable financing of public schools and greatly improved training of public school teachers. How does evidence-based policy embrace specific locations? In poor and working class neighborhoods across the nation, we need genuine community policing, where specially trained officers really partner with indigenous nonprofit organizations. Such truly innovative community policing should encourage the kind of community-based banking that was so successful before the Reagan administration. The banking should encourage community-based economic development corporations to construct affordable and integrated housing. The housing construction should create jobs for community residents and also for returning ex-offenders who benefit from evidence-based reintegration models like the Center for Employment Opportunities in New York. The jobs also should be framed as youth development. The youth development should scale up evidence-based models like Youth Build and Quantum Opportunities that provide mentoring, tutoring, and life skills training to high school youth at risk of dropping out. The mentoring should continue down to middle and elementary school, and all eligible children should receive preschool. In other words, evidence-based policy that works targets multiple solutions to multiple problems. Evidence-based policy is complementary and interdependent. Evidence-based policy is not separate and unequal. The scaling up of what works needs to be financed by the scaling down of what doesn't work, like trickle-down supply-side tax breaks for the rich, prison building for the poor, zero-tolerance policing, privatization of schools, and false rhetoric on empowerment, voluntarism, and self-sufficiency. Criticized by the Kerner Commission in 1968, the media today need to better cover what works. And the media finally need to recognize that the real story is dog bites man, not man bites dog. The real story is everyday violence, poverty, inequality, and racial injustice. With sufficient investment in human capital, a new Kerner strategy based on what works can reduce poverty, inequality, and racial injustice in a way that increases American soft power globally and that communicates to Russia, China, and the rest of the world that American values matter. As Joe Stiglitz has reminded us, America is in great need of such new soft power. Yet new soft power and new evidence-based policy cannot emerge without new political will. 50 years after the Kerner Commission, the creation of new will may be harder to achieve than ever. But we must begin. Some see things as they are and say why. We must dream of things that never were and say, why not? Reverend King asked why not. When he was assassinated in 1968, shortly after the Kerner report was released, his emerging vision was a multiracial coalition for economic justice among the poor, the working class, and the middle class. When Senator Robert Kennedy was assassinated just 2 months later in 1968, he too was advocating liberalism without elitism and populism without racism. He too, as Dr. King, was advocating a multiracial coalition for economic justice. That coalition needs to be the point of departure for the generation of new will today. Reverend William Barber's National Poor People's Campaign against the immorality of poverty and inequality can help lead the way. We will be working with Reverend Barber in the coming months as the Poor People's Campaign arrives in Washington on Mother's Day, not very far from now. History has shown that successful movements in America are inclusive and opportunistic. Successful movements build constituencies and enhance alliances while maintaining their founding vision. That means Reverend Barber needs to be joined by other constituencies as he moves forward. Those Kerner constituencies potentially include the 18 million white Americans who live in poverty. Those constituencies include the high school leaders from Parkland, Florida, who have impressively organized the Never Again movement against gun violence, a movement which, on this Columbine Anniversary Day, has organized more protests and more in-school events. Those constituencies include millennials who are organizing against unreasonable college loan expenses. Those constituencies include teachers who have walked out of schools demanding higher salaries and new textbooks. Those constituencies include the women's movement, immigrants, and the LGBTQ movement. And those constituencies include most of the 99% of us who have suffered the greed and malfeasance of Wall Street. In support of these and other emerging constituencies, and in support of Kerner Alliance building, I suggest that American universities need to better integrate the documentation of what works with the creation of new will. Universities need to develop more ambitious programs in nonprofit organization management and in social movement management. More prestige really needs to be attached to degrees in such areas of concentration. Of course, a new Kerner Alliance can only be created outside of Washington, but legislation and funding must build on good government. President Roosevelt brought us the National Labor Relations Act. President Roosevelt brought us Social Security. Good government legislated the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and the Fair Housing Act. Good government now must invest in Kerner priorities and scale up what works. As we do so, we must be passionate. We cannot just be academic. We must be passionate. And we must never forget how the dream has been deferred. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun? Or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Perhaps that dream just sags like a heavy load. Or does it just explode? Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm the other Fred Harris. I'm not the Fred Harris who wrote the Kerner Commission report 50 years ago, so just to sort of clarify in case there's some confusion. I'm the Dean of Social Science and the Division of, Dean of, the Dean of Social Science in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Columbia University, and it's my pleasure to be a part of this conversation this evening. I'm going to be very brief. First off, I'd like to thank you, to thank my colleague Joe Stitlitz and to Dr. Curtis for the very passionate speech, and to all of today's panelists for inviting me to participate in this forum. The Kerner Commission, convened at the order of President Lyndon B. Johnson, presents a unique moment of self-examination and reckoning in our nation's political history. The Commission, a diverse group representing conservative and liberal politicians, lawmakers, civic and community leaders, was tasked with illuminating the root causes of the race riots which had broken out in major American cities in 1967. Their findings, delivered 7 months after receiving their charge, were direct and profound. The Commission's report described the American racial divide in plain terms, outlining American racial inequality at the end of the 1960s with exacting language. The document's most famous line describes, and I'm sure you've heard this line all day today, is two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. Revisiting the report, which, by the way, in its time was a national bestseller, one can't help but to be struck by its author's four warnings. The Commission's members saw and understood what lay ahead for America's urban centers and the nation's minority populations if conditions and public policy did not change. In remarkable lucidity, the report describes long-standing injustices suffered by black communities and offers strong recommendations to address some of the largest issues underpinning the civil unrest of the day, including themes that were covered today: access to economic opportunity, the crisis in housing, and policy directives to combat racist practices which hindered mobility in Black communities. Today, our nation is still struggling to confront the legacies of these problems. This forum is a cause for some measure of optimism, Assembled here are some of the brilliant minds who have taken up the Commission's recommendations and whose collective efforts are dedicated to countering the forces outlined in the report. 50 years ago, Newark was one of the cities rocked by the violence that prompted President Johnson's executive action. We are privileged to have its leader here with us to speak on the lasting impact of the Commission and his ongoing work on behalf of the people of Newark. It gives me great pleasure to introduce this evening's keynote speaker, His Honor Ras Baraka, the 40th Mayor of the City of Newark. Nearly 4 years into the term of service, Mayor Baraka's record of progressive leadership reflects his commitment to improving the conditions of all of his constituents in New Jersey's largest city. He leads an administration that has leaned into critical issues facing minority populations across America, including income inequality, educational access and opportunity, criminal justice reform, and community policing practices. We are grateful for the work he has taken on, for his leadership and insights, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to hear his remarks this evening. Please join me in welcoming Newark's Mayor, Ras Baraka.
Thank you. I appreciate the invitation. Usually don't get an opportunity to speak in environments like this. So I deeply appreciate it, and I appreciate the topic of discussion as well, as it is very, very, very important, particularly in the work that I do in the city of Newark. And I think that my job as the mayor is quite different than the job of mayors across the city that do not represent cities like mine. So not only do I have to deal with potholes, snow, and all the other issues, I have to try to create a group of people in my community that are brilliant enough and are smart enough and courageous enough to come up with ways that are transform and change this system and their lives. And then I have the deep and serious kind of work to keep them alive long enough to do that. This year not only marks 50 years of the Kerner Commission report, but also 50 years after the murder of Martin Luther King Jr. in Memphis, Tennessee, while organizing sanitation workers. I was born just a year later in Newark, one of the cities that burned and rebelled in 1967. And we're clear to call it a rebellion in Newark and nothing other than that. My father was hit over the head by a policeman during that time who happened to also be one of his classmates from Barringer High School, where he graduated. There's a picture I saw of him as a child chained to a wheelchair in a hospital bleeding from his head. My mother tells stories of running through the streets of Newark looking for him and having to reach out to international poets to call into the city to find his whereabouts. He was later charged in court, and one of his poems read as proof of his support of the insurrectionists that were raging in the city's third ward. He was convicted because of his poem. So I grew up in a tumultuous time when the city was under deep transformation politically and socially without any real economic help or incentive. I watched the city in decay, not just from this rebellion, but also from long-standing purposeful neglect and underdevelopment. King, in his latter years, before his death, was organizing a poor people's campaign that was mentioned and talked clearly about the radical redistribution of values, but also wealth. This is probably 2 steps away from what the Kerner Commission advanced. He understood that our problems were systemic and therefore consistent, even cultural. And it couldn't be solved by commissions, programs, committees, or even his eloquent words. The problems were not just about how people treated us, or even in today's fight to increase the minimum wage, but about a country that purposefully locked generations of people out of prosperity and social development. During the closing moments of King's extraordinary life, he began to see that the very people that stood with him in Mississippi against Jim Crow and racist violence was not willing to travel with him to Detroit and Chicago and Newark to fight the violence of poverty and isolation and systemic hatred. Those that went to jail so that we could eat at the same lunch counters didn't stand with him in order that we got the economic freedom to eat out those very restaurants. He gave a speech at Stanford University, and his topic was the other America, saying there were two Americas, one where dreams and prosperity were nurtured and the blanket of American democracy kept out the chill of inequality and indifference. Yet he said there was another America where democracy was held back by red lines that were drawn around cities, where inequality was nurtured in our children's psyche and poverty grew with impunity, locking people into a circle of despair. The Kerner Commission pointed this out, the same inequality, saying there were two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal, unlike Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896 that pushed America in the opposite direction, and solidified to me a permanent caste system in this country that we're still grappling with, that has since been eradicated through law but still exists in fact. The Kerner Report in '67 identified poor education, segregation, lack of housing, and poverty as key components to the civil unrest that visited Watts, Detroit, and my city, and many others. They implored the country to address these areas, and out of that came the Fair Housing Act of '68 that targeted discrimination and intimidation in housing, but that was not nearly enough. The issue, just like the issue with public accommodations in '64, wasn't about just allowing people to eat in their stores or to live in their buildings because of their nationality and race. It was that there was no pathway to decent and affordable housing that was not run down, dilapidated, and inferior. There was no real access to wealth, to home ownership, or social services that were not underfunded. The report even suggested that we should be allowed to move to mostly white suburban communities to be closer to jobs as a free ride off an island of hopelessness. I believe that that was the wrong idea. That prescription only addressed segregation and its practices that still exist today, in fact, and fell short of arguing for investment, development, and empowerment in neighborhoods long left out in the cold. It refused to go to the root cause of these problems. And now that jobs are trending back to the cities, we have still found ourselves left out, and mostly jobs that have been inaccessible to my residents. Some 50 years after the Kerner Commission, our cities are relatively languishing in the same conditions. And while it's not fair to say that nothing has improved in general for African Americans in this country, it's safe to say that progress is largely uneven, and there exists a growing and stubborn gap of inequality between whites and blacks in this country, as we have still failed to address the root causes of these rebellions. In fact, we have failed to have any real consistent and deeply meaningful discourse around race and inequality in America. We are comfortable talking about wealth inequality, but not race. Or we're comfortable talking about race outside of wealth inequality, but not race and inequality together. It is still an uncomfortable conversation, and worse, remedies have recently been met with serious intolerance and aggression. African Americans today are much better educated than we were 50 years ago, but are still half as likely to have a college degree. While wages have gotten better, we are still almost 3 times as likely to live in poverty, and the median white family has about 10 times the wealth as black families. In fact, the unemployment rate for African Americans is higher now than it was in 1968. Our infant mortality rate, though gotten better, is still more than 2 times that of whites, and where I live is 4 times that of the state. And there are more African Americans in prison today than there were in slavery at the height of this institution. This country, we are 6 times more likely to be incarcerated than whites. And it wasn't until a little over a decade or more that we began demolishing high-rise projects to replace them with scatter site housing, which still did not result in access to growth or development, but spread poverty throughout the city, densely populate certain communities, and spread zip code determinism, where your life expectancy can differ dramatically in just a mile or less. Though we have come a long way, there's an even longer way to travel. In America today, there's a growing concentration of wealth in the hands of a few. In fact, globally, today a child born in the bottom fifths of incomes in this country has less of a chance to rise out of that than most post-industrial nations, and certainly less than they did more than 50 years ago. A majority of Americans will be poor at some point in their life because of loss of job and lack of savings. And recently we have heard that 21 hedge fund managers have more wealth than all of the nation's kindergarten teachers combined. And this economic picture for African Americans is much worse. In this period, 3 out of 4 of us will be poor at some point during our life. And African American parents that manage to move out of poverty and accumulate wealth is not a guarantee for their children. In fact, the majority of children born in middle-class black families will find themselves in the lower fifths of society in some point of their lives. And even as we witness $4 billion worth of development in my city, our residents are largely locked out of real growth as we struggle and have reduced unemployment and have implored our anchor institutions in Newark to hire Newark residents, to raise their level of procurement, to spend in our city and focus on neighborhood businesses and warehouses, and to invest in our neighborhoods. It is still not enough. And even as we create inclusionary zoning ordinances to mandate affordable and low-income housing in new developments and force them to relocate some of their monies and investment into areas outside of downtown, we still need more. And as we encourage local vendors and incubate new businesses, focusing on minority and women businesses, we still do not have enough and will not achieve the level of growth we need to see any real significant transformation. And the incidents in places like Ferguson and Baltimore speak clearly and become more menacing to what the possibilities may look like if we don't address these issues soon. And not just police and racist violence. We need to figure out how we get this large systemic foot off of our necks, particularly in a time where white supremacists have been characterized as good people, and programs created by the Great Society, the New Deal, the anti-poverty years are being rolled back, where basic access to health care, housing, voting, and civil rights are being challenged, and now even food stamps. So what do? I often ask myself as I struggle daily with America's problems in a city like Newark, which way do we go forward? How do we get people involved? How do we sustain this kind of post-Obama-like post-Reconstruction? How do we build the interest and keep our community as excited about the future as they were when they were electing the first African-American president for 2 times in a row? And more importantly, how does that help me in my city? First, we need open and clear policies that seek to dismantle a system of hatred and violence that murders 12-year-olds with BB guns in open carry states, or shoots men in the back running away, or chokes them to death, or throws people out of Starbucks for participating in an American cultural norm that was designed for people of color, that was not designed for people of color, or better known as chilling out at a coffee chain. We need policies, not just words that aren't afraid to say Black Lives Matter. We need real federal and civilian oversight with subpoena and investigatory power and concrete consequences for police action. We need police officers to live in communities they police. We need racism to be a crime. We have to demand real gun control and attach it to mothers in my city that lose children every day because they have access to assault rifles that find their way across state lines. There's a war in our neighborhoods, and we have to acknowledge that, and we have to treat it like a public health crisis. The same way we attack epidemic diseases, we have to attack violence in these communities, and gun control is a part of that. We have to stop telling lies that there is a crisis in American education. That's just not true. More Americans graduate from high school today and college now more than any other time in history, and that includes black people as well. The crisis is in our cities that are wrought with poverty and indifference. The education crisis in our community, where every experiment and reform shows up, and the first thing we have to give away is our democracy. There is no education crisis in this country. There's only a crisis with poverty and segregation and fear and lack of resources and white supremacy. We need to invest in public education, particularly community schools, and build a wall, a scaffold around our children of resources and after and before school opportunities. Pay teachers more money, create opportunities for parents, build more public schools, and desegregate the curriculum. Yes, desegregate the curriculum before we desegregate the schools. as most of us still attend segregated schools. In fact, Frederick Douglass High, the school where Thurgood Marshall attended, is still 90% people of color in Baltimore. And now it's overwhelmingly poor. In fact, this was the first school that took to the streets in Baltimore after the Freddie Gray killing. The most important thing we must do is what I say, create an urban Marshall Plan. There was not a New Deal for us. In 1933, Jim Crow was alive and well. And our soldiers later came back from World War II to find deep poverty and racism. No programs to pull us out of poverty and unemployment. And America has not had the stomach to do anything that forceful since then. In fact, most of these policies have been debated, find its origin there from Glass-Steagall to Social Security. Bold things to push America into more democracy and pull many into the middle class, but by and large skipped over entire segments of the population, mostly black and brown. Out of that was WPA programs that put the chronically unemployed and unskilled laborers to work. Later, we also began to see a flight from urban centers as the government began to subsidize college and housing in suburbs and build roads and bridges that connected suburbs to cities that allowed people to live outside of the city but still benefit from its economy. In fact, one of the key triggers to why Newark went up in smoke in 1967 was the building of 78 and the creation of what's now known as University Hospital. In fact, they drew red circles around entire cities and discouraged development today, with the trend going back to the cities where the American GDP is created. The red line has been taken off some of the city, mostly downtown and near public transportation, but the rest of the city still looks like it did for the past 5 or 6 decades, which is why we are forcing investment in those communities. Abandoned properties, vacant lots, no retail, barely any supermarkets or banks, where the Community Reinvestment Act did not make it. There's been no incentives to develop in those neighborhoods, nothing to fix infrastructure, to invest economically at all, no subsidization of any kind. So we need, like what happened in April of 1947, the Marshall Plan or the European Recovery Act. Gave $13 billion to war-torn Europe to rebuild roads, schools, encourage business and economic growth, but also to push a kind of Western democracy. Today, that money would equal to about $130 billion. We never got a New Deal. In fact, we didn't get an old deal. There were no massive works programs for us, and we certainly were not given billions of dollars for recovery after a war effort that has still been going on in our community since we arrived. We need those billions of dollars to directly go to our cities for infrastructure development of water and sewer, of roads and bridges, of transportation and schools and hospitals. We need dollars for job training and transitional employment. We need the private sector to be held accountable for helping to train and hire a local workforce. We need incentives for them to hire underemployed and monies for small business startups. We need summer jobs for our youth and college and students and outreach training and employment for those that have dropped out, which in my city on average is about 4,000 young people a year that contribute to a growing crime and violence. We need a comprehensive job development and neighborhood stabilization plan that does not seek to drive people out, but make them a part of society, that included community co-ops and building and backing public banking institutions. We need free education locally and pipelines that lead to careers, not prisons. We need money to create access to localized health care and primary care physicians that are both affordable. We need our real wages increased. We have to address a very real and growing affordable housing crisis around this country for every segment of the community, where people are spending 30 to 50% of their income on housing. We need to invest in voter and civic education and provide more with access to the ballot, not less. We need what Dr. King called for, a radical redistribution of wealth. We have to stop talking around it, have to stop making it look pretty, making it look nice, saying other things than what it really actually is, a radical redistribution of wealth. We need the money to change hands in this country. We need to consider those that have been in a suffocating and systemic poverty since they arrived here against their own will. They have been closed in, and while more and more of them have managed to escape the gap between those that have gotten away and those that are left behind seems almost insurmountable. We have to stop romanticizing what happened 50 years ago and talk about it as ugly as it is and was, and teach our children the truth about it. They weren't great times. They were dangerous times. They weren't romantic times. People were murdered. King, both Kennedys, Medgar Evers, Malcolm X. And we have to go beyond those findings and begin to discuss the root causes of these problems, and more importantly, do something about them. Or we'll be visiting 1967 sometime in the near future if we haven't already. Our cities and our people in them are desperately, desperately waiting for an answer to a problem that we have never addressed since they arrived here. And some 50 years after the post-industrial era, some 50 years after World War II, we are still in the same conditions that we were when the Kerner Commission was first written. We still are in a society that is mainly separate and wholly unequal, divided by race and nationality, by culture, by food, by dance, by language in this country. And we have yet gotten the will to do something about it. And it's important for us to go beyond these discussions and begin to craft real strategy to move ourselves out of these conditions. My mother said to me in an interview recently, or to the interviewer, the difference between my son and my husband is my husband was a poet, an activist, a thinker. My son is the mayor. My husband had the ability to be theoretical about things. My son, when he goes outside, people ask him for a job today. And I say that when I go out into these communities, my job is to get people jobs, to make sure that they stay on the raft long enough so they can strengthen themselves and strengthen their families. And maybe when they're strong enough, I can invite them to Rutgers University and we can debate the inequalities that exist in America. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Mayor Baraka, for those words, and thanks to each of you for taking time out to be here today. Thanks for the sponsors and everyone else who contributed to today's event. You will notice that I am not Alexis Johnson. I'm Michael Jeffries, professor at Wellesley College and a contributor to the Kerner Commission anthology that's part of the reason for today's gatherings. I'm going to serve as moderator and give each of our panelists to my right about 5 minutes to say a bit about their work. Then I will ask them a question or two, and then I will open it up to the public for discussion. If you'll just indulge me prior to those introductions, I'm going to make two very quick points about where this discussion has been today and where we might go in the remainder. The first thing I want to note, and it's a point that's been raised a couple of times already, is that the recommendations of the Kerner Commission were not accepted by President Johnson, largely because he was unable to and unwilling to accept the racial reality, the reality of racism that was at the kernel of so many of the center of so many of the Kerner Commission's findings. But despite the fact that President Johnson did not accept the recommendations, the Kerner Commission report and the political activity around that moment had a dramatic impact in the form of the war on poverty. And the war on poverty was not a cure-all, as the mayor described. Many of the problems that exist today have existed literally for centuries in this country. But it did have a couple of lasting effects in terms of policy: Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, policy interventions that had just incredible legacies in terms of lifting people out of poverty. And if you look at the 10 to 12 years immediately after 1967, that's what you see. You see an overall reduction in poverty in this country, and in particular, dramatic increases in the quality of life for the elderly and for children. They were not evenly distributed across racial groups, but they were real and they were there. And I make that point about the brief success of the war on poverty to say that the recommendations and the policy pieces that were put in place, despite the rejection of the recommendations, they worked. They proved that government can do something about poverty. Nixon systematically dismantled the Office of Equal Opportunity and started a rhetorical war that changed the way many Americans thought about poverty and who deserved to be poor, right? Racialized, of course. But the point is the government can and did for a brief time do something about poverty in this country. And what that fact shows us, right, what the empirical data show us then, is that these questions about whether the government should do something now are not practical questions. These are fundamentally moral questions. Fundamentally moral questions. And if we're going to have policy discussions, sophisticated as they may be about the practical impact of X policy versus Y policy, if we have those discussions without a robust discussion of the moral implications and mandate for the policy in the first place, we are kidding ourselves. That's the first point. This is not a practical matter anymore when it comes to whether or not government can do something. It's a moral question. The second point I want to raise is one of the arguments I make in my chapter in the book, which is about the nature and character of institutionalized racism, capitalism, racialized capitalism. And it's about the daunting monster that we face on a day-to-day basis. Institutionalized racism is thickly woven, durable, and flexible. And Dr. Gooden earlier in the day talked about some of the connections between housing and education, and the connections between education and incarceration, and the connections between incarceration and employment, and the feedback loop that turns back into housing, right? And the fact that all of these things are so thickly woven together, that the monster is so vast and so adaptable and manages to survive and punish people from generation to generation, that's a daunting enemy for all of us to face. And when I talk about this problem with my students, one of the greatest dangers they face and we face is the problem of paralysis. It's intimidating, it's frightening. We know how long this monster has been alive, and it's moving and hurting us in so many different places. What should the site of our first attack, our first parry, be? And we can get scared by that, and we can freeze when faced with that choice. But the importance of having a panel like this today is that we have living examples of people who have made choices about where to strike back. And these contributions that they're going to tell us about are going to serve as examples, even for those of us who may not have their particular passion or their particular area of expertise. They're going to serve as proof that if we do something and do it to the best of our ability, it can make a difference. So with that, I'll briefly introduce our panelists and get out of the way. Dr. Philip Atiba Goff is the inaugural Franklin A. Thomas Professor in Policing Equity at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. He is the co-founder and president of the Center for Policing Equity and an expert in contemporary forms of racial bias and discrimination, as well as the intersections of race and gender. He serves as one of 4 principal investigators in the CPE's National Justice Database, the first national database on racial disparities in police stops and use of force. Jasmine Gripper is legislative director for the Alliance for Quality Education. She is dedicated to educating parents, students, legislators, and community members on their power to influence and advance policies that ensure all children in New York State have access to a quality education. She is also a veteran organizer of Obama's 2012 field campaign. John Pfaff is a professor of law at Fordham University, where he teaches criminal law, sentencing law, and law and economics. Before coming to Fordham, he was the John M. Olin Fellow at Northwestern University School of Law, and he clerked for Judge Stephen F. Williams on the U.S. Court of Appeals in the D.C. Circuit. Sean Dove is the CEO of the Campaign for Black Male Advancement. He has served as a lead organizer of the Executives Alliance to Expand Opportunities for Boys and Young Men of Color, brokered a partnership between Open Society Foundation, Bloomberg, and the City of New York to launch the Young Men's Initiative, and helped seed the launch of the White House's My Brother's Keeper initiative. Dr. Heather Ann Thompson is a historian on the faculty of the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor and an affiliate of the Faculty of African American and African Studies, History, and the Residential College. Her recent book, Blood in the Water, The Attica Prison Uprising of 1971 and Its Legacy, has been profiled on numerous television and radio programs, won the Pulitzer Prize in History, the Bancroft Prize in American History and Diplomacy, the Ridenour Book Prize, the J. Willard Hurst Prize, and a book prize from the New York City Bar Association. With that out of the way, I'll let them get to it. Thank you.
Sure. The clock is already ticking, so let's
So good evening. Thank you so much for having us all here. It's a real tough act to follow after the mayor. I feel like all of our solutions are going to sound pretty lame after that. But I just wanted to actually just very quickly say that we were asked to talk a little bit how our work connects to the Kerner Commission and revisiting the Kerner Commission and maybe some solutions for where we are. My work really connects in two ways. I'm a historian. My first book was on the city of Detroit and was fundamentally interested in why had Detroit exploded in 1967 and really thought about the Kerner Commission in those historic terms. But much more recently, I have been thinking about the Detroit that's now trying to be gentrified, the Detroit that's now allegedly coming back, and all the ways in which we have completely missed the lessons of the Kerner Commission, and indeed, as the mayor said, are really run the risk of creating another serious problem that will lead us again into a 1967 situation all over again in Detroit. But what I mostly work on is the criminal justice system now, and I work on what happens after the Kerner Commission report, which is that we do something historically unprecedented and internationally unparalleled, which is to lock up more human beings than any other country on the planet. And I think that this is actually important because today we've heard a lot about all of the things that in the wake of the Kerner Commission we have failed to address. We've talked about how poverty's gotten worse. We've talked about the educational gap getting even wider. We've talked about really every unimaginable injustice that seems to have gotten worse. And then we've also talked about the criminal justice system. And I want to just suggest that I think one of the most unfortunate things that we failed to understand with the Kerner Commission was that when we embarked on this war on crime, when we embarked on this kind of solution to social problems through the criminal justice system, that exacerbated everything else and made it worse. It is not just that the crime and justice issues are alongside of income equality or alongside of educational gaps. They actively and intrinsically make all of those things much worse. So from my point of view, the solutions to where do we go next and what the lessons of the Kerner Commission are is to not make the mistake that the Kerner Commission, with all respect, made, which was to put so much emphasis on inequality, as it should have done, but miss the fact that criminalization and a faith in criminalization and an emphasis on criminalization will undercut equality at every single step. And in fact, the same people, the good-hearted people who were imagining solutions through the Kerner Commission were in fact the same people who were doubling down on this war on crime that over the next 40 years would lead us into this nightmare. The year we pass the Voting Rights Act is the same year we create the Law Enforcement Administration Act, the bureaucracy that will make this nightmare that we live today possible. The same year we get the Kerner Commission, 1968, we also get passage of the Safe Streets Act, one of the most diabolical pieces of legislation in terms of building prisons, arming police officers, and really starting this path of taking resources out of the community and putting them in the criminal justice system. So I think this is 68 is, or 2018 is an opportunity to think about the Kerner Commission, both in terms of its prescriptions for what we could get right. I think those are still valid. I think that those are still worth, as many people have said, revisiting, taking seriously, doubling down on now. But we got to also pay attention to what they got wrong, I think, which was really missing this elephant in the room, the cost of criminalizing poor people. We are now living with that, and I think that the solution now cannot be anything other than tackling criminal justice, an overhaul of the criminal justice system at every level. Because if we do that, then in fact, incomes become more equal. In fact, educational disparities begin to contract. In fact, all of the injustices become more just if we tackle this missing thing, this elephant in the room. And I'll just leave it there for now.
So I think I kind of follow up kind of nicely with that, because I want to talk about how to fix the criminal justice system a little bit, at least my perspective. Might not be, I follow from Heather, I'm not sure she will agree with everything I suggest, but you know, I've spent all my time trying to really understand how we got 1.4 million people in prison, and we say another 750,000 in jail. I don't like that number, because people spend a little time in jail. I think it's better to emphasize how many people go to jail every year. We have about 10 to 12 million people admitted to jail every year. Right? It's not all the same person, not all different people. Some are repeat entrants, definitely not all the same person. Much more different people than same person. It's a sprawling, massive system. But I think we sometimes suggest solutions that might, that misstate sort of how complicated it will be to get out of it as well. So as much as we talk about, and as problematic and difficult and impermissible a social solution the war on drugs has been, the fact is the majority of all people in prison are there for a crime of violence. At the state level, which holds most people, is driven by violence much more than drugs. And the violence and drugs are tied together, and if I had 50 minutes, not 5, I would answer all the questions I know are racing through your minds right now. They're valid, I have rebuttals, I have 3 minutes left. It's violence, and violence is a much trickier thing to solve. And I think here's where Jim Foreman's book, that also just won the Pulitzer this year, is very helpful. Because what he points out is that when African Americans are confronted with violence, and violence is concentrated in disproportionately poor minority communities because of underfunding education, redlining, and the pathologies we've talked about today, they tend to demand 2 things. Right? They want social support, and they want criminal justice control. And at least in DC, the government gave them a choice, one or the other, and we're going to give you criminal justice, none of the social support. Right? And I think it's important to think about why. Right? Because the challenge that violence poses to us is that the solution to responding to violence isn't going to be anything legal. Right? No one wants to decriminalize aggravated assault. Right? The question is, how do you respond to aggravated assault? Right? How do you choose to use our discretion? And what Jim Foreman shows is that when the crime is concentrated in poor black communities, we choose to respond just with law enforcement. Elsewhere, we choose other approaches. Right? As a relatively well-off white kid growing up in Buffalo at the age of 17, which in New York State is the age of an adult for a violent crime, I punched a friend in the head. Assault, not aggravated assault, because it was me punching and it wasn't much of a punch. It was a dumb schoolyard fight. There were no cops around, right? If there were a cop, they wouldn't have arrested me. There are no cops in my school, right? And no cop in school would have arrested me, because that's how wealthy white kids have violence dealt with. It doesn't make it acceptable. But the question is, how do we manage this discretion that we have? Right? And it's a challenge. It's a challenge I thought about a lot today when someone quoted the head of the District Attorney Association of New York saying that reformers don't get it. They don't understand the criminal mind. Now, there's no such thing as the criminal mind. Right? There are people who commit crimes. They all have minds that are different. Right? But it reflected an underlying attitude. Right? Because you can be sure exactly what he was thinking about when he said the criminal mind. Right? And the racialized dog whistle that was. Right? So the question is, how do we deal with this? And I think one thing to think about is sort of the geography of criminal justice. Right? The single most powerful person in this entire system is a prosecutor. And what's tricky about the prosecutor is they're elected by the county. Now, for most cities, they aren't their own county. They're part of a bigger county. Now, within that broader county, say Chicago, right? Half of Cook County is the city of Chicago. Half of Cook County is not the city of Chicago. Political power disproportionately resides in those non-urban suburbs, the wealthier, whiter, more conservative suburbs. They vote more, and they have more power. They feel the benefits of being tough on crime. Right? Talking of 2 separate distinct Americas, the powerful part feels the benefits of crime reduction. They go to work and feel safer. They go to see a show on Friday nights and they feel safer. They believe you fight drugs in the city, they won't come to their suburban schools. Believe that. But they don't feel the costs. right? They don't feel the cost of that enforcement. It's not their brother, not their nephew, uncle, brother, sister, son, daughter who's needlessly stopped, arrested, detained, jailed, put on bail, convicted, gets a felony record, all the consequences, put in prison, dies in jail, dies in prison, gets shot by the police officer during a stop, right? So the people who choose the prosecutor, who play an outsized role in choosing who enforces the law, they feel none of those costs, but all the benefits. And you don't have to be a very good econ student to understand that when one person feels all the costs, not the benefits, that is like the econ 101 definition of an externality, right? But it's a lethal externality here, one that's destroying entire communities. I think we have to think very carefully about this disconnect. Right? So if nothing else, I feel like it's time to try to figure out how to devolve criminal justice responsibility to as local community as possible. Right? To give the cities a much bigger say than the county. There's no reason why ring suburbs of Chicago should have any say in how law is enforced in Chicago. They don't feel any of those costs, but they get to actually choose disproportionate prosecutor. Krasner's victory in Philadelphia came precisely from mobilizing urban voters to drown out the suburban voters. Right? That's why we have someone like Krasner in Philadelphia. Right? I think we need to think very carefully these sort of technocratic, bureaucratic rules that play a huge role in driving how the system malperforms.
Great, right on time. Sean Dove, really excited to be here. I feel like the kid sitting at the adult table, and wanted to make one correction in the title of my organization. It is the Campaign for Black Male Achievement and not Advancement, and I think that's really important in the framing of this conversation 50 years after the Kerner Report. The Campaign for Black Male Achievement was launched at the Open Society Foundation in 2008. It was supposed to be a 3-year strategy to improve the life outcomes of black men and boys in America. You know, philanthropy looks at a generational 390-year issue in America and says that we are going to solve this with a 3-year or 5-year grant-making strategy. We decided very intentionally to lift up a positive asset frame-based approach around the challenges that black men and boys were facing in the United States. And that framing was that there's nothing wrong with black men and boys in America. It's the systems, it's the structures, it's the toxic waters that we are swimming in. And folks could not get their heads around the name of the campaign, Black Male Achievement, and having black male and achievement in the same sentence. So I just thought it was ironic that we said black male advancement. And no, it was not about marginalized men. It's not about disconnected dads. And so in my stream of consciousness that I have in the next 3.5 minutes, I first wanted to say that it's an honor being here, and Mayor Baraka, thank you for your comments, and I need to get a tape of that. And it is a tough act to follow, but we all have to follow it. And I also have to say that I too have a PhD from UCLA, and that's from the University of the corner of Lennox Avenue. That's not too far away from here. You used to teach there, right? Yes. So a couple things, cutting straight to the chase. I think the whole day could have been spent talking about the radical redistribution of wealth. I think the challenge that we're all facing here is how much do we want to come out of our comfort zone. I think that we have missed an opportunity today. When I look around this room, we were talking about movement building earlier, and we all know that all movements in anywhere in this globe, young people at the front of this movement, right? And didn't hit me until I was sitting here looking around. We could have went to the Grant Projects over here. We could have went to Manhattanville, and we could have had some young people here. Just have to say that. Over the last 10 years, and I would say that one of the things that I realized that America didn't need a campaign for black male achievement. What we needed was a corporation for black male achievement, an endowed philanthropic enterprise that can lean into this issue for the generation that it will take. We are talking about millions, particularly in philanthropy, when we need to be talking about billions. That's the battle that we are in. I love the metaphor of the monster, right? And we've all seen the movies and the mythology. And how do you kill the monster? You got to cut the monster's head off. And what I don't think that we are, so there are many elephants in the room. But I think the mother elephant or the king elephant is the conversation around white supremacy. And that unless we cut that head off, we will be having this same conversation 50 years from now, on the 100th anniversary, and I don't know how many of us would be here for that, but so a couple of thoughts that I want to share in my last minute. We have to, when we're talking about black men and boys, tap into the power of positive deviance, which tells us that the solution to the world's most intractable problems lies in the heads, the hearts, and the hands of the citizens and the communities that sometimes we come in and try and parachute and help. I think that is essential. I think that unless we focus on wealth building, and I would love to talk to you about the issue that we're doing in Detroit, and where we have 25 men that are going through a year-long wealth building strategy and are then buying property in the third quarter. Because when we look at inequality, we have to look at wealth, where wealth is the power. And until we do that, I'm afraid that we're going to continue to feel like we're shooting BBs at an aircraft carrier, right? And so there is so much that we can do, but I think the radical wealth distribution is what needs to happen.
All righty. Thank you, Mayor Baraka. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, panel before me and panel to come. Thank you for everybody who is here on a Friday. This is supposed to be the solutions panel, right? And we're the wrap-up, right? So we're supposed to bring some good news. I guess we're going to have to get the gospel during the Q&A, because I don't have good news to start with. I have fights to pick, and I have angers to express. I'm going to pick a fight first with my good friend John here. And I don't mean that rhetorically. John is genuinely a good friend. You'll see us on Twitter continuing this conversation probably about 3 o'clock in the morning. My fight is not just with John, though. It's more broadly with the way that we talk about criminal justice reform, which is that we don't talk about criminal justice reform. We don't even talk about criminal justice. We talk about incarceration. That is not the same thing. Incarceration is not the same thing as criminal justice. And unfortunately, we have made that slippage to the point where we forget that the reason we get to talk about this on a national stage is because young black and brown boys and girls are littering the streets of America at the hands of police. Police are part of the criminal legal system. And while the prosecutor may be the single most powerful individual at any point along the criminal legal process, they're usually standing behind a couple hundred police officers that are way more powerful in terms of the individual lives of the people they touch. This is part of the ways in which I feel like we are failing both the spirit and the reason for the Kerner Commission 50 years later. There is not a single city that is on the list of, they called them war-torn cities, of insurrections that preceded the 1967 need for the Kerner Commission that had not been plagued by police violence immediately preceding the uprising of the individuals in that city. Not a single one. But I want to paint a little picture for you of the landscape that we're dealing with right now in terms of race and policing in the United States. We all have seen videos. We know it's a big deal. But we know even more the history of people getting locked up. Tell me that same 50-year history of people getting shot by the cops. Anybody who's got the data, come to me. I invite you now or later. That's a rigged bet right there, because I know you don't have it, because I literally have more data than anyone in the history of the world on policing. This is the humblest of all brags. It is a very low bar. I'm just proud to step over it. But at the Center for Policing Equity, we host the National Justice Database. I think it was in the bio. Shout out to Amanda Geller, who was another one of the PIs, and Jeff Fagan, who is, I'll say the father and not the grandfather, but the father of the movement to analyze police data. But we don't have a 50-year trajectory on that. We don't have a 10-year trajectory on that. I'm sitting on top of a massive data. I don't think we have a 3-year trajectory on that. A couple of cities maybe, but we don't know. And here's another portion of the landscape I want to paint for us. The National Philanthropic Budget for Criminal Justice Reform is somewhere in the range, right? Is somewhere in the range of $210 to $220 million annually over the last 5 years. That's up from $50 million, and that's good. And of that $210 to $220 million, about $200 million of it is going to decarceration efforts. About 10 to 15 going to policing. Whatever you want to say about the power of the criminal legal system to affect change or to afflict it in a community, you cannot tell me it's a 20-to-1 issue. You just can't do it. I mean, you can, but then we both know you're lying. So we're supposed to be talking about solutions. I got about a minute. Center for Policing Equity, what we do is we leverage the insights from behavioral science and data science to come up with solutions that will help law enforcement to engage in practices that are more consistent with community values. The National Justice Database has, at this point, about a third of the United States by population in the database. By saying we have about a third of the United States by population, that's public data and data that have been transferred directly to us. Most of the data are classified as terrible. They're god-awful. And you can't possibly analyze it. But for the ones that we can give you a picture. And here's the key. The picture we give you is not just of disparities, because in every American city there are racial disparities. Black is more likely to get stopped, more likely to be arrested. But that's the correlation fallacy for those of you who passed that intro stats class, right? And what law enforcement will say back is, well, but that's where the crime is, and that's where the poverty is, as if criminalizing poverty is okay. Here's the nice thing. When you get a robust enough model, you can say, this is the part that's responsible, that crime is responsible for. This is the part that poverty is responsible for, and we'll deal with, overlapping variants on that later. But this is the part that belongs to you. We can give that back to folks. And in collaboration with the social engineers and the electrical engineers at Google, we now have the ability to do that instead of over 9 to 12 months, in 9 to 12 minutes. That's where we're going to be by the end of this year. So there is an opportunity moving forward, but only if we're actually going to talk about the rest of the criminal legal system. And I guarantee you, if the communities that were worst afflicted by the things that we were talking about were in this room, they would demand that we would talk about it.
Thank you. Wow, thanks. It's important that we're here because research and advocacy go hand in hand. The advocates, we are the boots on the ground, we are the public demand, but the research is our evidence, it is our proof, it is our tool that we use to make our demands. And we started this panel by talking about striking back. So when public schools are under attack, what do? We stand up and we fight back. Parents have been fighting back. Students have been fighting back. Many people talk about today being the anniversary of Columbine and how there was another set of student walkouts today. But before white students were walking out, Black students were doing walkouts. The Philadelphia Student Union were doing walkouts demanding funding for their public schools. Systemically, our public schools have been underfunded. They have been starved into failure. And then as a result of the failure, they justify state takeover, removing of local control, and turning over to privatizations like charter schools to take over our schools. But parents are fighting back. We are unpacking the problem, and we are pointing to the real problem, which is our states not fully funding our schools. AQE was started similar to what Sean said about the campaign for Black Male Achievement. We were originally started as a campaign. We were only going to exist for about 5 years. 15 plus years later, we're still here. AQE was created in response to the Campaign for Fiscal Equity lawsuit, where Mike Rebell from Teachers College partnered with a parent from New York City in Harlem, from Washington Heights, to sue New York State for not providing enough funds for our public schools. This court case took 13 years to decide. AQE was going to be the public advocacy arm, the PR campaign, organizing parents around this lawsuit. We won. The court said the state was violating students' constitutional right to a sound basic education and ordered that our schools get $5.5 billion phased in over 4 years. 15 years later, our schools are owed $4.2 billion still in New York State. So the problem always goes back to money and finances because we refuse to pay for the education of poor Black and brown children. We have a governor who says money doesn't matter in education, but that's always the complaint when it comes to poor kids. It's always the complaint when it comes to Black children, is that we don't have enough money. And we all know that that's a lie. We don't want to spend the money on Black children. And that's why parents are organizing to put demands on elected officials, on our legislatures, to do the right thing. We know that in this state or in this country, politicians have never done the right thing just because it was the right thing to do. They've done the right things because there's been public demand to do it. And that's why our advocacy is so important now than ever before. New York State was one of the first states to put money towards My Brother's Keeper initiative to make sure we were targeting funds. But let's be careful that we don't celebrate a few $1 million here and there when we know billions of dollars are what's owed to our children, and billions of dollars is what's needed to correct the problem that we see in our classrooms. So when we talk about right now, we're suing New York City about not reducing class sizes. Dr. Curtis mentioned we know what works, but yet year after year they tell black children we need to experiment on you. We need to figure out what works in education. We already know what works. We just don't want to pay for it, right? So we know early education works. We know that having quality childcare works. We know that full-day universal pre-K works, yet we still don't have it. And so we can tout in New York City's pre-K for all 4-year-olds, but 80% of 4-year-olds outside of New York City in this state still don't have access to pre-K. So this state is still failing our youngest New Yorkers. We know that smaller class sizes work, yet class sizes keep going up. We know that teacher diversity works, yet we refuse to work on investing in a diverse teacher force. We know that children learning about their own history works, yet we refuse to diversify our curriculum and teach proper history from multiple perspectives. And so the issue isn't that we don't know what works. The issue isn't always that we need to do more research, because there's plenty of research there. The issue is we need to fund it. And that's where we always hit a stumbling block, because our legislators, our elected officials don't want to undo the institutional racism that exists in education that requires us to fund our schools. And one of the last things I do want to point on is integration versus segregation. Everyone talks about integration being a solution. I'm not against integration, but I want to be clear to say black children don't learn because they're sitting next to white children by a process of osmosis. Black children only learn by sitting next to white children because we refuse to fund schools that are primarily filled with children of color, right? And so if we don't undo the institutional racism, we tell our black children that the only way you can get a quality education is by you going into a school that doesn't want you and where your culture won't be valued or taught. But what we want to do is that you can go to an all-black school, you can have all black teachers, and you should be able to still get a high-quality education, but that requires us undoing institutional racism and funding schools in black communities. Thank you.
Thanks to each of the panelists for the remarks. I'm going to prompt you all with a couple of questions that I hope any one of you will feel free to jump in on, and then we'll open it up for discussion. The first question I wanted to ask is about whether or not our current political moment changes your sense, your personal sense of priorities in your work and in your field, or requires a shift in strategy or tactics with the work that you are currently engaged on. Because I think one of the nice things that's happened during this panel and some of the work during the day is we've historicized so many of these problems and seen that these are not 2-year-old problems, right? These are problems that have been generations old, which might suggest, well, we don't really have to switch anything up in this dire political moment, no matter how dire it may be. It's just part of a longer historical trend. But I wanted to get your sense of whether or not there's a sense of desperation or a need to shift strategies right now because of who's in the White House, who's in the Justice Department, what state politics look like in this moment. Is there anything there with respect to shifting tactics and shifting strategies?
So I'll quickly say hell yes to that. I would say, people say that, the current president has divided the country, but I've seen the current president unite a lot of folks. And when I think of the work of Black Male Achievement, the importance of cross-movement building and finding ways to partner with other groups, immigrant rights groups, Me Too movement. I think that what happens is there's a lot of siloing. As a leader, and at 55 years old, I feel myself becoming more radicalized, and not in the sense that we hear on TV at night, but more radical in the risk that I need to take as a leader, more radical in acting with urgency, more radical in finding where we can build momentum And so I think that this current moment, we've been here before, but it is feels a little different and requires, I know for me and the work that I do, more radical action.
I want to say for education, this current administration has given us some leverage. I think the reality of our schools is that both Democrats and Republicans have been selling out our schools to privatizers, but there's been an unveiling now when Trump seeks New York City's person, Eva Moskowitz from Success Academy, to possibly be his education secretary. It causes people to now have pause and question her and her motives. And what she's been doing is caused our Democratic governor, who's consistently given extra money to charter schools and been giving them increased control over public spaces, to now roll back or rethink his privatization agenda. So it's given us new leverage, but it's really been exposing Democrats, corporate Democrats, who've been allowing privatization of our public schools to persist, and we need to call them out and demand not only do you stop that, but that you start investing wholeheartedly in public education again.
I guess interesting, I'd say, for at least when it comes to prosecutors, it hasn't really had any impact at all. And I think one thing, at least in a lot of criminal justice issues, and I know Phil and I disagree about policing versus prosecutors, and he's right about policing, I think I'm right about prosecutors, is that it's very local. Right? At the same time people were voting for Trump for president, they were also voting in very progressive DAs in 2016, 2017, 2018. DAs are county officials, and they're chosen by the county, and you're not going to solve criminal justice with a federal bill. You're not going to solve criminal justice issues with a state bill. You're going to solve it by dealing with 2,200 prosecutor offices and 18,000 police departments, all of whom respond to very, very local conditions. And it might be glamorous to testify about criminal justice before the U.S. Senate in some gilded room, but you're fixing in some dingy county office building under fluorescent lights, trying to convince the DA not to do what he does, or convince some police chief to stop doing what he's going to do. I would just also briefly say, I don't think I actually disagree with Phil. I agree. Policing comes first in terms of its size, its impact. I'd say the difference is that the goal for policing is to fix it, which is an important but tricky question. The goal for prisons is more or less to stop it, right? Even if you just care about law and order and reducing crime and care about nothing about the social costs, you're a pure tough on crime, law and order guy, prisons are an utterly horrible way to reduce crime. Right? They're just terrible policy no matter what you look at. Right? And so I think it makes it for a cleaner issue to address. And that, the goal is just less. Phil has a much more difficult job, which makes the funding disparities all the worse because he has a harder thing to do with less money. And also put that $200 million in perspective, we spend $200 billion on corrections and law enforcement all told. Right? So the philanthropic spending is 0.1% of what we are hurling at all this. Of course, the state spent about $3 trillion on state and county budgets, so that $200 billion isn't even a lot that much, which makes it easy to do this punitive stuff. I'll stop there.
And I would add a couple of elements in terms of the new administration. I feel like I should put that in quotes or spit when I say it. One thing I will say is that while a lot of prosecutor reform and especially the takeoff of the bail reform movement and the rest has continued in the wake of the loss of democracy, it's been a lot harder for the folks who were on the fence fighting police unions from the executive position in law enforcement. So you had a lot of folks who were thinking about adopting new policies, who were looking towards demilitarization, who were looking just not to do that anymore, right? Just there's, like the doctor says, it hurts when you do this, so don't do this. We were going to do that with policing towards the end of the last administration. And there are folks who were on the fence who are now scared because of the empowerment and the partisanship that has come with the rhetoric from the White House. Right? And I don't think that we can overstate what has been lost in terms of the momentum on police reform in particular with the change of administration. That's not the case as much with the rest of the criminal legal system. So there's optimism there in a kind of progressive federalism, right? Well, there's reason for some...
Less depression.
But I say lack of utter hopelessness as we're talking about a broader or liberal federalism. But I think that it's just not there. When it comes to police reform. I'll throw out another number. There's about $250 million for the COPS office budget that was going towards progressive reform in policing. All of that money is gone with the extra T.
I want to, just to jump in, I actually kind of wanted to echo something that Jasmine said. I mean, I think that there's no question that we're living in a state of emergency right now with the Trump administration. And it's certainly mobilized people for all kinds of really profoundly important reasons. But one of the things Jasmine said I think is so correct, which is that the other thing it's done, though, is laid bare how absolutely fragile that reform moment was, how thin it was. And in fact, to bring as the historian on the panel, it just sort of vindicates what historians have been saying all along, which is that this entire debacle we're in was bipartisan in origin. It remains on a bipartisan basis. And the fact that Trump is able to shout out what he says more grossly, more audaciously, more loudly, does not take away from the fact that, yes, budgets have dried up, people's will seems to have people have gotten more skittish. It seems to have kind of, gotten on the back burner. But the fact that you could have a crisis of this magnitude and to have it just, absolutely reform possibilities kind of evaporate that quickly overnight, to me says a lot about how deep that pool was to begin with. And as someone who does work on prisons primarily, certainly the lived experience of people in prisons, that reform moment, it had a lot of promise and there was a lot of optimism, but certainly on the ground, the guys I've been talking to all week inside of South Carolina right now, they didn't feel 2012 a whole lot differently than they're feeling 2018 in terms of the white supremacy, the absolute, the policing that led them there, the conditions that they face when they're in there. So to me, it's a wake-up call about, if we think we're going to solve this through the same liberal solutions that the Kerner Commission thought we were going to solve them with, and no offense to the Kerner Commission, but these are so much more systemic and endemic problems about inequality, about racism, about white supremacy, about income inequality. And to me, the Trump moment is the wake-up call that we need a much deeper overhaul, economically, socially, politically, racially, if we ever imagine this reform moment to have real meaning. It shouldn't depend on one election of one man. It wasn't deep enough to begin with then.
I'm just going to ask one more, and then I'll open it up to the group. And I'm not quite sure how to get the question out, so you'll have to bear with me. But it's a question motivated by some of my opening remarks and then the remarks that Jasmine closed with about the relationship between activism and emotion and a kind of moral reconsideration of what the problem actually is. And I think, Heather, your most recent comments sort of point us in that direction as well. If we're going to do this more courageous examination and reformulation of what the problem is, I would love to be able to hear about examples of discussions that you've had, either in a policy context or in an organizing context or in an advocacy context, where something was discussed, something was argued, something was said, something was offered in terms where someone in the room woke up. Someone in the room, you felt it, someone in the room came to conceptualize the problem in a way that you perceived they had not before, or maybe they articulated they had not before. Those kinds of understandings can often come from direct engagement with young people who are less timid, as many of our panelists have described, than many of us who are stuck in our ways. But I just wonder if we could put a couple of examples, if you have any, at the tip of your tongue, on the table for us all to hear about, because I think those kinds of moments of imagination are so vital today.
Even though I went last, if you'll indulge me, I think I have one to share that I think it's really been, I've seen this on the ground with young people since that's what I do. I teach on a daily basis, which is that when we do, whether it's in community or community youth discussions or whether it's in the classroom, we often get hung up on this question of how are we going to fix this? Particularly the question of violence. How are we going to fix this? There are people who commit crimes. There's a lot of bad out in the world. How are we going to deal with it? People seem very, very unable to get over, there's serial killers out there is what people always go back to. But when I do this exercise with them, which is just really quickly, if you'll indulge me, we start and we say, look, just for a moment, imagine the person that you love more than anybody in the world. It could be your child, your partner, your parents, and really do it. Like imagine that person and imagine the worst possible thing being done to them. That thing that just is your boogeyman, the thing that horrifies you. What would you want to do with that person? And, you know, of course, universally, all young people, no matter where they're from, they're like, I mean, there's no punishment too severe, there's no penalty too severe, torture's game, death penalty, you know, 50-year sentences. But then I asked them, imagine, okay, that same person, remember that person you love more than anything, you just found out that they did that thing, that unimaginable thing to someone else. And you just watch people kind of say, my first question would be, where was I? What could I have done? Did you need something? Did I miss it? And what would you want them to do? Well, you'd want them to pay restitution. You'd want them to make it right in some form. But would you want to torture them? Would you want to electrocute them? Would you want to lock them away for? No, you'd have one goal, which is to make this world safer, right? To make them more whole, to make the world safer. And that's not so much what we've been talking about today with income inequality, but it's that kind of just bring it home. And people have a very difficult time being so punitive, being so aggressive, and seeing the problem is so insurmountable. Because if it were home, they'd have 50 solutions other than the ones we're doing right now.
So quickly, the Campaign for Black Male Achievement has been working in the city of Sacramento for the last 2 years, implementing a strategy called BMA Health and Healing strategies. We discovered a few years ago that the adults, the leaders, were traumatized, stressed out, depressed, wanting to commit suicide. So we had been in this community, another number of communities. But I recently spoke to one of the leaders, organizers responding to the Stephon Clark murder by police in Sacramento. And I asked him, why do you, because there was a point in that first few days where he had sent me a text and said, young people are on edge, worried something is going to happen and jump off in this city. And I asked him, a couple of weeks, after, why has Sacramento not exploded like Baltimore or Ferguson? And he said from the ground a couple of things. He said the income disparities in Sacramento, while wider, were not like what they were in Ferguson and Baltimore in the pre-conditions. He said that they were organizing young people all the time, and one of the things was because they were in the capital, and so there was this organizing activist spirit as opposed to a reactionary spirit. And he also said that the response in Sacramento was more of a focus through the organizing on macro justice with reforming police reform and policing reform as opposed to the micro focus on ensuring that the 2 cops went to jail. And he just lifted those things up, and that's just a word from the ground in Sacramento that struck me, because there is another Ferguson, Baltimore that is bubbling this very moment, and we have got to be ready and prevent it.
I'll add this one thing. Oftentimes in advocacy, we are torn between this big picture worldview shift that we really want to see and fighting for that, and what's the real small incremental policy win we can get right now. And we are torn between, do we ask for what we really want, this big picture change, or do we try to fight for a realistic policy win that we can get that's tangible right now? And I was talking to a young person one time, and I said, imagine this radical idea if we fully funded our schools. And the person looked at me and responded, and she said, fully funding our schools isn't radical, it's justice. And I wrote that down on a piece of paper, and I put it on my laptop so I could see it every day, that I don't even get warped in by this society, that thinking that fighting for what's right is radical, rather it is justice, and we need to continue to fight for justice.
I'd say my experience, Phil mentioned we debate things on Twitter because I spend probably too much time on Twitter, but I find I like it because you reach a far bigger audience than I would just talking to my colleagues or talking to my students. I mean, you can reach thousands of people at a time. And I'm always fascinated by what gets attention and what doesn't, right? So lots of things that seem to be shocking and horrible, and how can you not be horrified by this? People are like, whatever. But the one thread I had was that really caught on. I think it kind of gets to Phil's point about, like, people just say, well, that's just where the crime is, that's where it is. It's sort of the ability to push blame back onto African-American communities, which you shouldn't do. Because I had a thread on prison gerrymandering. Right. One of the most viral things I ever tweeted, right? So those of you who aren't familiar with prison gerrymandering, which I referred to in this tweet intentionally as the 5/5 compromise, in 46 states, prisoners count for the census as living in the prison. And in 44 of those 46 states, they can't vote. We're one of the 4 states where you count living there, but where you can't vote, but you don't count as living there, right?
Because of activists.
Because of activists. And so yes, at the end, the academics point things out the activists have done. I have no delusions about what the academic side of things accomplished, to be clear. So it's a shocking thing because it moves basically, prisons are full of minority men from urban areas who are disproportionately Democratic, and they get moved to disproportionately rural prisons where they can't vote, but they count as residents for the purpose of the census. And so there are state legislators all across the country who maintain their seats entirely because of their prisons. It's why the first Rockefeller reform law in New York State was a total joke. It looks great on paper. If you do the math, they did nothing. Because the Senate was almost down to Democratic control. And the Republicans knew in New York that if they actually put a meaningful Rockefeller reform law change in place, the prisons would drop so much and move so many bodies back to New York City and Buffalo, they would lose control of the Senate. Right? New York State changed it during that brief 6-day window between when the Democrats got the Senate and the IDC came into existence. And when that window existed, for about 48 hours, they rammed this through as one of the first things they did, to move all the bodies back to New York City and Rochester and Buffalo. Now, its overall impact is probably pretty slight. Right? One study in Pennsylvania found that if you unprison gerrymandered Pennsylvania, it would move about 3 seats back to Pennsylvania, back to Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. It would not completely fundamentally change things. But the benefit of it, why I think it really connected people, is you can't talk your way around that one. Right? There's no purpose behind that besides just purely moving black votes to white neighborhoods, white areas. Right? And it kind of disarmed any ability to say, well, actually, how about what? Right? There's literally no how about, what about, well, that's just where the what is. Like, this is entirely designed to move black votes to white areas and deny them votes. And I think sort of being able to talk past all the excuses and all the other sort of victim blaming you can do, it actually really caught on in a way I found kind of surprising.
I got caught up in that Twitter feed, didn't realize it was you.
Yeah, it was one of those. It's the only time I've seen people talking about the tweets when I wasn't even part of them. It was very kind of funny. Like, it really caught on. I was like, this is kind of important, but in the grand scheme, it doesn't really matter directly. But emotionally, it was able to tell, like, this is about race in a way that sort of the more complicated story sides don't.
So I resonate both with what John was saying. We were tweeting back and forth with each other as part of that thread. And Heather, how you started us off. So my day job is I'm a professor. My day job is also that I'm just a professional nerd all the time. But Michael, to your original question, I was trying to think through it. I was like, so people who have seen the light or people who have kind of woke up, never when I'm talking with community spaces, because they don't need it. Exactly. So I think that when we're talking about who's waking up, I want to name that I'm talking about mostly privileged spaces, and I'm talking about mostly white spaces. And where it's happening is that I get to do this little spiel on, because I'm an implicit bias guy. I want to be clear, not all bias is implicit, and that implicit bias doesn't change everything. I'm from Philadelphia, and nobody is more upset by what's going on at Starbucks than I am, mostly because people at Starbucks keep calling my black ass. But I'm an implicit bias guy, so I get to tell people about implicit bias. And for me, the end point on the other side of the conversation is that implicit bias is only a big deal. It is only really sexy and seductive if your definition of racism is racist. And this is what I mean, right? And if you're really excited about implicit bias, I have really bad news for you. The idea is that what causes racism? Well, it must be racial bias of individuals. And we know that it's structural and it lives in structures as well. But on some level, we're talking about hearts and minds. I want to read a quote. I brought it here just for this, because whenever I show up anywhere, I like to have a Thernstrom quote ready. So Stephen Thernstrom, on the 30th anniversary, critiquing the Kerner Commission, says, because the Commission took for granted that the riots were the fault of white racism, it would have been awkward to have had to confront the question of why liberal Detroit blew up while Birmingham and other southern cities, where conditions for blacks were infinitely worse, did not. Likewise, if the problem was white racism, why didn't the riots occur in the 1930s, when prevailing white racial attitudes were far more barbaric than they were in the 1960s? As if white racial attitudes were the reason why anybody was in the streets. I don't know if you've ever been part of a citywide uprising, but nobody's like, white people don't love me enough. That is not an actual thing.
okay? If you thought that it was, I have bad news. But the reason why implicit bias is so sexy is because it locates the problem inside of individuals, but it's not my intention. That privileges the potential character of someone who potentially could be doing racist stuff, and by doing that, it occludes or marginalizes the accumulated harms going on in communities. When you privilege the intentions of white people and marginalize the harms of black and brown people, you're doing some racist stuff. So I get to teach this every day. I get to teach it to police officers. I talk about it in communities. When I talk about it in communities, I get a standing ovation from the black folks. I get very confused looks from the other people in the room. Okay? So when do I get it? When does anybody wake up? Kind of every day, because it's literally my job to do that. But also, it's only my job to do that because I teach at a university. Right? It would only be my job to do that if I was on, when I'm on the news, when I'm on TV, when I'm doing all that kind. The point is, that is not where the win is. The win is in actually stopping the accumulated harms and in changing the definition so we care less about the character of racist individuals and more about the lived experiences of those who have to receive it.
I guess I have to tell Phil too, there's one drawback to Twitter is that you can't see what other people are thinking. You can only see that when you're in a room with people. And so I would just say that one other instance in which you have caused someone to have sort of a sense of, oh, I never thought it that way, was actually about 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, and you had a tweet thread about that very point, about racism privileging the thoughts of the white person, not the impact on the people they're being racist towards. And I myself had that sort of, oh, damn, kind of moment. So I just want to thank you for that, because it will, it was this tweet thread of yours, and you couldn't see the look on my face, but it probably was confused at first. And then nope, not confused, it makes absolute sense. So there's at least one other instance that you didn't see that happened.
Fair, but to clarify on that, you did tweet both of those emojis at me, so I kind of saw it.
We've got just over 5 minutes left, so I'm going to open it up to the audience with a very gentle request that your question is actually a question and not a comment. So are there any questions from the audience for our esteemed panel? I'm very happy to keep peppering them myself. Yes, please.
So thank you so much. This has been a really enlightening discussion. And one of the questions that I always find myself struggling with when I think about criminal justice and incarceration is that there are still these state-level laws that deny voting rights to people with felony records. And so I would love to hear any thoughts that you have about how to change that, how that could possibly exist in the pursuit of justice, supposedly, when people have paid their debt to society.
If I can go first on this one, just so that I can sort of link back to my very first comment, I believe that we need to be doing a much better job on policing. I believe that the number one best thing that we can be doing from an organizing perspective is felony reenfranchisement in Florida. Right? And there is significant ballot initiative work and organizing happening on the ground, because and frankly, the ways in which this administration has aggressively disenfranchised the people of Puerto Rico to move them to Florida may get the job done for us. But if we get reenfranchisement if we get felony reenfranchisement in Florida, I think there's a decent chance we get something like democracy back in terms of the federal elections.
Can I say about that, just implicit in the question is, when any of us ask it, is that somehow this has something to do with criminal justice or crime, or something to do with our crime, public safety, something to do with that. Mm-hmm. And once we understand it has nothing to do with that, the first time we disenfranchised half of the South was in the wake of the Civil War. You had 4 million newly freed people who wanted basic human rights, housing, jobs, and so forth, and the response was to do 3 things. First, to criminalize all black spaces. Secondly, the Georgia penitentiary goes from being all white to all black overnight. Then you take away voting rights and you put people to work. And then you fast forward, we do that yet again after 1965, after the next big freedom struggle, right? I mean, and it wasn't about crime in 1965 in the same way it wasn't about crime in 1865. In fact, the more we incarcerated people, that's when the crime rate started to get really, really bad, because violence got worse. Because like in Prohibition, right, the violence rate goes up 78% in 3 years when we make alcohol illegal. So
the first answer is this isn't about the criminal justice system. This is about politics, it's about political control, and it's about any time people have a political structure where they are in power, and then all of a sudden that is deeply, deeply threatened, as it was in Detroit in '67, and in Newark, and in Watts, and the response is we're going to criminalize those spaces and we're going to take away people's right to vote. And that's not just some political statement, that's historically bound out in really critical moments in our past. So we're not going to fix that without a fight. The crime rate's already low, right? It's not about that.
I'm going to take Jeff. Go ahead.
So you don't want to comment. So in California, there were two propositions in the last couple of years, 47 and 64, both established the right for reenfranchisement. There are NGOs all over California doing reenfranchisement. There's one at Stanford in one of the clinics called Second Chances. They also have an outpost in Santa Clara to serve the San Jose population. Cuomo had a gun to his head, and so he signed an executive order to do this. We're not sure if it's a fixed terms executive order, like the AG investigating police killings, but it might be kind of it. But you know, so these are political pressure points, and I think it's right. I think it's good. This is real. The symbolism of doing that is really pretty powerful. So that's my.
Yeah.
So all you all who are in places other than New York,
We've just got time for one more thought. Sit down, please go ahead.
There's a significant possibility of civil disobedience during Reverend Walker's Poor People's campaign starting on Mother's Day. How would that fit into the structural reforms that you're advocating?
Talking about Reverend Barber's? Yeah, I just want to make sure. Yeah.
We are wholeheartedly participating in Reverend Barber's Poor People's Campaign. If folks haven't been aware, they've been doing testimonies and gathering people's stories this whole time. And they have a pretty good agenda, from public education to healthcare for all, and to just the whole idea that our budgets are moral documents. And so, as any good advocate, you'd use any situation to leverage your issue, right? And so education folks are always organizing parents and students to be involved in civil disobedience. I'm not sure if we're going to go to DC, but we might do it at the state capitol in Albany. But the reality is putting pressure on elected officials at every level of government that they are being held accountable for the budgets, especially when they constantly tell us there's not enough money for our issues, and we live in a wealthy state and a wealthy country.
I would just add that, and I forget that he's now the Bishop Barber, right? So you get a promotion, you want to make sure you get recognition. I would encourage that the entire movement make sure that they talk with their local advocates when it comes to issues of police reform. Because the one thing that is for sure to derail the civil disobedience, make for great headlines, is when law enforcement is called to disperse them. When that's not registered, or when law enforcement has been given license to do extraordinary elements. And what I know from folks who are organizing in Charlotte and in St. Louis, in solidarity with the DC event, is that I have concerns. And that because we haven't tended to the ways in which we regulate law enforcement, that there's a decent chance that the narrative that should be about empowerment of those who have been most marginalized will be about the ways in which the state violence targets them.
And let's remember that if it's as successful as we hope it will be, that moment, that moment of speaking up from the grassroots, every time it's successful, the way that it's undermined is by criminalizing it. Mm-hmm. And if we don't learn anything else about what happened in 1968, we've got to understand that the more powerful the social movement, the response is always to beat it back through the criminal justice system. And once we understand that, once we understand it's happened every single time, then it's not just the police on the ground, although that's critical, but it's also starting to talk about it like they were disruptive, they were thugs, it wasn't really about civil rights, they needed to be reined in, that's why they all got arrested. And then you lose the hearts and minds of the nation because they've been successfully criminalized, and therefore that's not legit anymore. So that's the real, historical watch out moment.
I was also going to add that it's important that white allies show up, or allies that don't have criminal records show up, because, you know, we have folks who work with us who have, because of policing, who have a criminal background, and so they can't participate in civil disobedience, and they will be there and gather and support, but they will not participate. And so those of you who have the privilege of not having a record, you know, definitely show up and be an ally.
We'll have to end on that. Will you join me in thanking our panelists for all their work and for their comments this evening?